record.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, good evening and welcome everyone. It's just great to have you here for the launch of our Bach Odyssey, le lancement de notre Odyssey Jean-Sebastian Bach. Trois grandes séries, les suites pour violoncelle, les sonates et partitas pour violon seul, et les chorales de Leipzig pour orgue. So it's a real pleasure to join with my colleagues Eleanor Fry and Emanuel Vukovic, and of course to have all of you with us too this evening. This is just great. So glad you could join us, and we hope that you'll join us for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings for the next 18 weeks as we go through this series. So first of all, I should say a couple of thank yous. First of all, to the Church of St. Andrew and St. Paul for supporting this huge project so generously and being a home to great music. I've worked at the church now for 15 years, and it's a terrific place. It's, you know, just a home of all sorts of innovation and richness. So very grateful for that. Our sound and light technician there is Stratzimir Dimitrov, who just goes from strength to strength in his production skills, as you will see. Also, a special thanks to St. Matthias Church in Westmount, where I'm recording the Leipzig Chorales, which you'll hear on Wednesday evenings. They very generously gave the use of their space and the use of the instrument. It's quite different from the instrument at St. Andrew and St. Paul, and it speaks Bach very well. Also, a special thanks to Juget Sinclair, the organ builders, who've lent us the positif at St. Andrew and St. Paul and tuned the big organ at St. Matthias. So, and Earthworld.
Can you explain why you need the portative, like what it was used for?
Yes, absolutely. The Leipzig Chorales are settings by Bach that he wrote early in his life and then revised later, but they're chorales, they're hymn tunes that were very familiar to the 18th century German listener, but for many people today, they wouldn't be known at all. So we thought it would be a good idea to precede each of those chorale settings with just the hymn tune sung. So Nathaniel Watson, one of our great local baritones, is singing the chorale, and Eleanor's playing cello, and I'm playing the small organ before we do each of the big settings by Bach, just so that you get a little bit of a sense of what to listen for when you hear the setting.
So preceding each organ prelude will be a chorale with the singer and cello and you.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's on Wednesdays. No, on Thursdays.
Yes. Wednesdays.
Wednesdays, yeah, okay.
Cello Tuesdays, organ Wednesdays, and violin Thursdays will be the format from here till the end of June.
Yeah.
So we have three, as you've deduced, we have three series running in parallel. So on Tuesdays, Eleanor will be playing all of the cello suites. More on that in a moment. I'll be playing all of the Leipzig chorales. More on that in a moment. On Wednesdays, and Emanuel is doing all of the solo violin sonatas and partitas on Thursdays. So this has been a huge voyage for all of us, a journey. I think, I don't know about Emanuel and Eleanor, but I know certainly for me, the Leipzig chorales I've known since I was in my teens, some of them. And they're the kind of music that I think you play for your whole life, and you continually feel that you're starting to learn. So it's musical work, it's technical work, but it's also a real inner journey. And I think, you know, we'd like to share a little bit with you about why this is so significant to us and what it means. So I turn the floor over to Eleanor, who can talk first about the cello suites.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming to our talk. And for those of you viewing later, I hope that you enjoy the series. Yeah, the three of us decided to collaborate on this project. And personally, I mean, obviously as a cellist, I've played the Bach suites, either a whole suite or a series of them for concerts, and I teach them, and they're sort of constantly present in my life as a Baroque cellist and cellist. But for a long time, I wasn't so into them, as in I wasn't sort of offering them to presenters. I wasn't, you know, feeling like it was something I wanted to do with my free time. And mostly I was trying to learn all about Italian music. And I recorded CDs and performed and just did so much Italian music. And I felt like that was my contribution, was to show everybody that there's solo music and sonatas and concertos, all not Bach, other music than Bach. And I wanted to, really make an impact to get people playing Baroque music and myself listening to, so playing myself and other people listening and other people playing, other than Bach in the Baroque era for the cello. But I think I did that like pretty rigorously for like 10 years. And I do think I made an impact. And then I felt, especially with the onset of COVID, that I was more and more ready and more interested with this, to start a deeper relationship with Bach. And I also, um, having done all that work with the earlier music, with music before Bach, I felt like it prepared me to understand the context, and how my instrument started and all the solo music before it and around it and just after Bach. And so it made a wider and bigger vision, rather than, let's say, what before I played Baroque music, which I was a modern cellist playing romantic music, and then just, okay, I play one piece of Bach as my Baroque thing. And that was a very narrow perspective on Baroque music. So I feel more ready now to approach Bach with this wider perspective of more experience with other Baroque music. And also, the pandemic means that I was kind of by myself, not playing with other people. And I also was teaching a lot and trying to help others learn about Bach's music. So I read and I taught a course at McGill. Um, and then I decided as a personal journey that I wanted to work on memorizing. And I just sort of had not been playing from memory lately because I didn't really have to. It was completely acceptable for me to perform concerts not from memory, and I didn't feel compelled personally to do that. I didn't feel any shame around it. And when I decided that I wanted to see if it brought me to a deeper connection to the music, I actually read a book about memorizing, and I took a couple lessons from somebody who's a bit of an expert on it. And I started working on the process and making it fairly systematic and fairly rigorous. And I feel like I've built some confidence that this could be possible, that I play so many pieces for memory. And so this is part of this journey of to go to St. Andrew and St. Paul, which is this special home. I've been playing there for a long time, and I feel very connected there. I feel like it brings the best out of me, and to sort of try this first experience really for me to play all 6 suites from memory over a period of time. But that's the goal, is to really internalize the music, work on it systematically from memory, and then perform it at AMP, and to see what happens. And so far, all three of us have recorded our first chunk pieces. And I have to say that I feel, having played from memory the first suite at AMP, that it's just a much richer and deeper connection to the music that I could never have imagined had I not just tried it out. So I'm just really grateful for AMP and my two colleagues to like be part of this journey that is, I think, going to make a big impact on my life. So that's what I wanted to say to start off. I'm sure there's more questions and everything, but I will hand it over to Emmanuel, who's going to talk about his violin music and his own personal journey with this Bach. So, yeah.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jonathan. Thank you both to you. And thank you to all of you for being here. And I see two faces, but I'm curious who in the group are violinists or cellists or organists or play Bach, or I know there's like these little hand.
The violin is my favorite instrument. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't. Wow. I love the cello.
Okay, let's switch.
Well, so this is actually my second journey through these works. I performed them at Chapelle Historique du Bon Pasteur last semester. I did 3 concerts in October, November, and December, to a sonata and a partita on each concert performance. There was no audience, but they were live streamed and recorded. And then over New Year's, on New Year's Eve this past year, I played a live recital for a few friends, and performed all 6 of them in like a 4-hour time span, without music, and that was pretty. It was pretty great. It was pretty an unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's like, yeah, it's you feel like you. Anyways, so this is, but it's I remember when I was younger, it was like in a Kiwanis music festival, an adjudicator said once to me, he said, Bach is like water. It's like water or air. It's like you or we often say it's like our bread and butter. It's what
You
it's what
live
so
on.
much.
Yeah.
Pardon?
It nourishes you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and what I would like to explore in this conversation, I've just recently am finishing my doctorate, and I've been thinking about timbre, this idea of timbre in music as a formal element of musical. So we often in music we talk about rhythm being like we talk about melody or pitch, and we talk about harmony. And traditionally, we could say those are the 3 elements that that music has been built on anywhere in the world, in any kind of in any culture. And different musics have focused more on one element or another. And we often say that the Western, the Western canon or Western classical music has really explored harmony, harmonic language, and it's maybe a stretch to say, but what Aristotle is to Western philosophy, Bach, Bach was one of the founding fathers of or really developed harmony. Of course, he was building on the shoulders of many people before him. So each of these partitas and sonatas or suites are they're in a different key that we're exploring. And so thinking about harmony or tonalities in terms of timbre, in terms of like what is the color of this key versus this key, and is E major, the chaconne is in D minor. Many of the darkest pieces, many of the requiems, are all in D minor. Why is that? Is that because, and why is E major, why is like the last partita, which is a very bright, joyous, why is that? Why, so he has the open E string, anyways. And so I'm exploring that question in this project in relation to the beautiful stained glass windows in the AMP church. And kind of, so I'm working with Jean-Paul Desjardins. He's a videographer and someone that I've worked with in the past, and we are connecting images of the windows and kind of the feeling, the colors, that I'm going to call them the timbres of these, with a specific partita or specific movement of a sonata or partita, and kind of thinking about how what are the moods or the qualities of these characters. And it's interesting, I talking about memory, I remember once a science teacher said to me, when you're studying, if you use colors to if you associate, people often say they can, memorizing in terms of colors or patterns or so yeah, these are just I think we're all going to just share some initial questions or some initial thoughts, but that's something that I've been thinking about on this journey of these pieces, and that I would love to explore with.
Do you have synesthesia where you see?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I'm no. I mean, I a very good friend of mine does. I've done some research on it. No, I definitely don't.
Yeah.
I don't even have perfect pitch, so I like my,
You're fine.
it's,
No. Yeah.
it's blue one day, it's green the other. Like that's no, but
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. For me, the Leipzig Chorales are fascinating because they're from the manuscript. They're found in the manuscript that is the largest manuscript of organ music in Bach's hand that we have. So it contains the 6 trio sonatas, it contains those 18 chorales as well, although only 15 of the 18 are actually in Bach's hand. The third to last and the second to last were in the hand of Altnickel, who was his student at the time and became his son-in-law. And then the last one, the so-called deathbed chorale, which we'll talk about in a minute, is in the hand of an anonymous scribe. So we don't know who copied that one down. And the earliest entries in that manuscript by Bach of the Leipzig chorales were put in 1739 to 1742. And then some of the others later on, as late as 1747, 1748, probably. But that's a period in Bach's life when he was cementing his legacy in a way. You know, he was putting together major things like the Klavierübung for publication and various other published works, and B minor mass and definitive kinds of works that were art of fugue, that he was saying, okay, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. This is a perfect example of genre X. And the Leipzig chorales are interesting because if we look at, say, the Orgelbüchlein, the little organ book, which is a set of 45 small scale chorale preludes, they're a perfect model of how you develop a small motive with a chorale in a variety of different forms. Pretty much every single genre you could do in a 1 or 2 page chorale prelude, Bach did in the Orgelbüchlein. And then the Klavierübung 3 has a very clear program. It begins and ends with the prelude and fugue in E flat. And then there are chorales that deal with various aspects of Lutheran doctrine, going systematically through the Lutheran catechism. So there's a clear program to that one. The Leipzig chorales don't have as obvious a program to them. They're not obviously associated with one season of the church year, although they tend to have a kind of association with Advent in one way or another, many of them Advent and Christmas. But it's a question as to whether Bach was planning to publish them or thinking about publishing them in some kind of a cycle and didn't get to it. What is striking is that all of them were written earlier in Weimar, much earlier in his career, and then he came back to them and revised them at least once, if not twice, and very significantly. Now, the interesting thing about Bach's organ works is that he didn't revise in a way that makes editors of critical editions happy. It doesn't make their lives easy, because with a cantata, for instance, he wrote one in Arnstadt and then he took it out in Leipzig and needed a cantata for Sunday X. So he revised it, he expanded it, he added some movements, he reorchestrated and made new parts, new transpositions. Maybe the singer was better in one voice part than another, so he moved things around a bit. So there's a very clean, you can draw a stemma. You take your Arnstadt source and you take your Leipzig source and you can say, well, this is derived from that, and there's a clear, But in the organ music, he was often using the organ music for teaching. And so he was in contact with that much more than with the cantata music that was really occasional. He needed a cantata for a specific Sunday, therefore he was busy with that in the lead up to that Sunday. But the organ music, he was constantly teaching, and his students were making copies so that they could work from copies, but then they had it with them in lessons. And there's a wonderful quote about Bach from Philip Emanuel, his son, that shows up in Forkel's obituary for Bach, published after Bach died. And it's something along the lines of Bach was constantly making the good better and making the beautiful perfect, or making, that he never let a thing go. So if you're trying to make a definitive text of any of the chorale preludes in particular, it's really, really, really hard, because you have really good quality copies written by students who we know were really accomplished students of Bach, and we have corrections in Bach's hand on those copies that he obviously scribbled down as they were discussing it in a lesson. But there's no way to really date those definitively, so you can't say, well, this change is the definitive one, or so it's a very fluid thing. And even with these Leipzig chorales, there are some cases that we have later versions of some of the pieces that have slightly different readings. But to me, the interesting thing is the overall trend line when we think about Bach's purpose in writing them. And I think there are two major themes, if not more, that I take from it. First of all, this notion of Soli Deo Gloria, I think, that it's all for the glory of God. I don't think that was just a formality of Bach putting that there. I think he really truly believed it, and I think that was a fundamental motivation for him in this drive for perfection. That he was really a child of the Middle Ages, in a sense, in terms of his worldview and so on, that he really truly believed there was a divinely instituted order of everything, that royalty belonged somewhere, and then the town council belonged somewhere, and then that social order was dictated that way, but also the order of the planets, and this very Aristotelian cosmic sense of the order of everything, which is in keeping with a lot of what we know from 16th, 17th century theorists who were going back to the ancient Greeks and so on. So that's one aspect of this quest for order and for perfection, and that that he really, we know from his annotation in the Caliph Bible, for instance, that he said, where there's perfect order in music, God is there. That it's not something that would make an Orthodox Lutheran very happy, and it would make a pietist lose his mind, of course, to hear that sort of almost pantheistic talk from Bach. But I think it really does help us get some insight into where Bach was coming from. And then the second aspect of that is that it wasn't just an abstract theological orientation. It was very much concern for other people too. He's constant with the Orgelbüchlein. He says that these are wonderful examples for the young, if they want to learn how to work out a chorale in many different ways and develop their skills and build their skills. And in the Klavierübung, we also have this thing that it's for enthusiasts who are keen about this sort of thing and who want to learn about perfection, the art of so that there really is this, the glory of God and the edification of others, which is a very, very key principle of the Reformation, that it's not that it's about the betterment of society and the betterment of individual people too. And I find that aspect of these Leipzig chorales very profound, especially when you think that they're pieces that Bach came back to again and again and again as a reviser. If we think about all the things that he had to do in his life, that he took the time to work these pieces over and over and over and over to find perfection and order, I find that very profound and very moving. So that's
I want to add to that and say that there's no real Bach revision of the cello suites, so we have a different case than what you're describing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting in terms of manuscripts to sort of follow the development of manuscripts in the cello suites can be just kind of a cool, fun topic, because the cello suites, we don't have anything in Bach's hand. So you have these multiple versions in Bach's hand, is that correct? And that leads to a lot of investigation. And the violin partitas, they have a manuscript in Bach's hand, but we cellists, we have nothing in Bach's hand, except for a version. The only kind of alternate version is the fifth suite, is there's a version for the lute. So we get some insight into, just something with maybe what he intended, or there's some slight differences, some rhythms, some added voices, and some ornamental differences, but it's by and large almost the exact same thing. And so we just have a very different case of, since we don't have the real thing, we spend a lot of time debating, well, should we follow the manuscript in his wife's hand, Anna Magdalena, seems to be the earliest, and then his student Kellner. Well, Kellner was a keyboard player, so is he writing, the slurs and some of the articulations, are they sort of with the keyboard in mind, and we shouldn't take that as serious? And then there's mistakes, and all the slurs are so confusing, and they're fluffy and too small and too big and wrong notes. And then finally, around 1750, we get a slightly more clean and clear manuscript, which is called the Westphal manuscript. And that seems to be a bit of an update, that where some of the ornaments and some of the slurs go a little bit towards the sort of gallant taste. And maybe as a player, is that something we want to explore, to sort of give into that? Or do we want to, think, well, maybe 30 years before, was that a different aesthetic, and maybe more variety to the bowings, more, sort of not perfectly balanced, or I don't know. Certainly the tastes are changing by 1750. And so, just the manuscripts alone kind of force us cellists to rework, revise. We're always spending huge amounts of money on the latest facsimile edition. And in a sense, I'm kind of grateful for that, because it's definitely forced me to ask a lot of questions. Whereas I actually play the violin music, not from memory, but I play the violin partitas. I'm working on them as well. And I get a little sort of lazy. Like, I just see the manuscript and I do what it says. It kind of works well. The bowings are clear and they make sense, and they're great. And that's it. And with the cello suites, it's just a bigger pain in the tush. And I feel like I've learned a lot from just being forced to examine this issue. So I think it's something like what you're describing, Jonathan, with the different versions, but our case is the different manuscripts.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Just by way of illustration, this is what the Bach's autograph looks like. That's the
The fifth
beginning of the
suite.
first chorale,
Oh yeah. Okay. Right.
Vom Heiliger Geist. Yeah, it's
That's his handwriting.
astonishingly clear handwriting and beautiful quality manuscript.
Yeah.
So, but there are still, even though it's a Bach autograph and he was a meticulous copyist, of course, there are still questions about the text. The editors of the Neue Bach-Ausgabe regularized a fair bit. I mean, they're very honest about it in the critical commentary, but if you really get into the weeds with, say, numerology and adding up total numbers of notes and so on, some of those mistakes may well not be mistakes. Missing ornaments that in places where there was space to put an ornament that would have been so obvious, but the ornament isn't there. You have to think, well, Bach making a fair copy at that stage of his life wouldn't have just casually omitted it. So why is it not there? There are also some very specific questions about the notation of the ornaments that, normally you would see this notation and you would say, well, I'm going to do this because by convention you would do that. But Bach is so specific in some of these pieces that I really think that the conventions a little bit go out the window and you go with specifically what he notated in some of these cases. Because in the same piece, he uses the conventional notation to express the same thing. So why would he take the trouble, that was actually more work, to write a complicated version of what looks like it could result in the same thing if you followed the convention in a parallel passage? It's a fascinating question, but it's what keeps us awake at night.
Yeah. And just to illustrate what I was going to about the manuscripts, you can buy a book this thick, which is all of each. There are 5 sources, actually. I mentioned 3, but where they're lined up, synchronized, and try to follow along and decide, which bowing, like that doesn't have the slur, but that does. And so I can just open this and give cello lessons talking about this for hours. I make my living here. Yeah. what bowing to use.
Right. There's actually a really great book by Anner Bilsma,
The
Bach,
fencing
Fencing
master, yeah.
Master, which is
Yeah.
I remember reading that a while ago, but it's really fabulous. It has so much humor in it, but it's really making I think he says because Bach used to fence. I think when he was in or apparently he may have taken fencing lessons, and the bow as a sword and like kind of the gestures. So forgive me, Jonathan. So when you talking about the discrepancies or the questions in the organ, we're not talking about slurs. We're talking about like
Notes and
notes,
ornaments.
ornaments, and
There are notes, there are ornaments, there's some rhythmic values, particularly when we get into the canonic variations on Vom Himmel hoch, which are also in the Leipzig Chorales manuscript. It's a question whether you play them within the whole cycle. For this series, I opted not to, but I did just play them in the fall at the oratory. So I think, I've got the cred of having just done them. So, but I didn't play them in sequence the way they should be. But I think there's actually a really good theological explanation as to why they're there in that manuscript, even though they're not like the other pieces. But that's a whole other discussion, and I won't get into that one just now because I could go all night.
Yeah, so I would love to try. I'm going to try to respond or continue with the question that you asked, which is, if the way I understood it was, what is the possible relationship between all of these, the fact that we know that that we can see that he was meticulous, that there was things that he was changing and improving and searching for, and even the search in the cello, everyone else's subsequent search for the bone, for the right bone, or what we kind of gestures and bowings, and in the and connecting this to this like religious or spiritual quest, you could say, or of order, or Bach's understanding, or and I think the musical expression of that order, we say often, is like in this idea of a figured bass, or of a bass line, and in the structure of music being built on on some kind of continuo line. And that I mean, the violin is not a continuo instrument, but music in this time was all, I think, was, and again, I think I have two colleagues that have played much more continuo parts than I have. But what's interesting in the cello and in the violin, is that he said in the violin sonatas, it's like, he writes it. So I'm just gonna share my screen here for a moment.
Sure.
I've lost the what do I?
You can do it now.
Yeah, I made you co-host.
Oh, okay, great. No. Oh, here. Sorry. Okay. Share screen. I'm sorry. I'm not finding. Okay, here we go. New share. Am I sharing the screen?
Yeah. Looks good.
So what I want to share with you is this image right here. So there's two things to remark in this image. Not that. Say solo. So it's a little bit of a play on words. because it could mean 6 solos, but actually in Italian, dove sei means like you are alone. Say I think means like
That means you
right.
are.
I'm is that correct, Eleanor?
Yeah, it's the second person singular for are. You are.
Right. So
Yeah.
you are alone.
Yeah.
And then he writes for violin senza basso accompagnato, without, violin without bass accompaniment. And then at the beginning of every, at the top of every sonata and partita, he writes again solo with, like, he reiterates redundantly that there is no continuo part bass line in this music, which is, it's not the first time that this has happened, but
Like, don't even try it.
yeah, I mean, I think
Don't you
what it
dare.
the way I understand it, kind of, I'm going to be a little bit philosophical about it now, but reflecting to like the situation today, it's like stay at home, don't have any contact with anyone else, isolate yourself, like I mean, it's like pulling the rug from underneath, like the very thing that holds music up, so to speak, and that like the entire ordering of our understanding of music has been built on is now not there. And we have to create it ourselves. Like it has to, and I'm sorry, I'm anyways, do you understand what I'm trying to say? I'm not doing a very good job of it. So
Well,
I don't know.
yeah, it's like an upset of the natural order. Yeah.
Pardon?
It's like an upset of the natural order in a
Yeah,
sense.
so it's and so okay, I'm gonna unshare my screen. Stop sharing.
Usually violin has a continuo or accompanies
Right,
even
right,
one other person, and of course a keyboard could play alone,
right,
but it has the harmony there, and
right.
so yeah, for sure, it's pretty intense. I mean, there's plenty of solo violin music before, but I think a lot of that music, like you'll see, for example, for example, Tartini. There's sonatas that work perfectly fine alone, but then he'll write a simple bass line if you
Right.
want to have some. So music, solo music, you can add a bass, you can have 3 people playing the bass, you can have 5 people playing the bass, or one person, or alone if you want, if you don't have anyone. It's more flexible, but Bach seems to be very much more rigid and specific here, which is unusual, the insistence.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the date of those, Emmanuel?
1720. We don't.
That early.
Yeah, I mean, he may have started them even earlier, probably, but that's when. Eleanor, you probably know more about this than I do, because I mean, they are part 1, and then the cello suites are technically part 2, right? They were kind of conceived of as a, or that there's a theory that it was like a set of 12. 12 is like, the complete, and 6 and 6 is, and
12 apostles.
We just don't have a manuscript to confirm.
We don't, right.
Yeah, I mean, he met Pisendel for sure in 1717, and there's shows a lot of influence from Pisendel's music, and thinking of who he might have inspired such, advanced writing. I mean, the violin music is truly virtuosic. But then if you look at Pisendel, who is this virtuoso violinist who lived in Dresden, where actually some of Bach's children studied, and Bach was known to visit, his violin music is just crazy. It just goes even beyond Bach in terms of difficulty in a couple spots. So I think maybe that was a spark of, this is possible, or just some kind of connection there with Pisendel. And then a similar time period, 1717, 1720.
What about Bieber? I know the Rosary sonatas.
Yeah, I mean, that's of course a possible influence. That whole German violin school is a whole topic that Bach was in contact with. And he also played in an orchestra in Weimar at the same time as a very important violin composer, Westhoff.
Right.
And
And he wrote
so
some amazing solo.
wonderful. So, I mean, there's no proof that they met, but it just seems impossible they didn't. I mean, they were basically in the same town at the same time, working as violinists. Actually, Bach's first main job was as a violinist,
Right.
and then later did more with keyboard and direction, and composition. So
Although it's alleged that his favorite instrument to play in the orchestra was the viola,
Of
because
course.
it was in the
Like
middle of the harmony.
why?
like every great composer.
Since there are no violists in the room, I hope. Well, it's interesting, the point that you made, Eleanor, about Bach's rigid insistence upon something, because that's the very thing that got him embroiled in the huge controversy with the critic Johann Adolf Scheibe in 1738 and 39, and somewhat earlier as well, but then they really got into it in 38, 39. And one of the major accusations against Bach by Scheibe was that he was way too specific about everything, and he didn't leave any oxygen in the room for the interpreter, because he wrote out all the ornaments and he wrote too many notes, and the contrapoint was too elaborate, and just everything was, and he had no sense of, he wasn't cultured, he wasn't educated. And it's true. I mean, Bach didn't have the kind of classical education that, say, Handel or Telemann had, because they were both trained as lawyers and had that kind of, seen. And in the discussion, and Scheibe also was trained as a lawyer and in philosophy and the classics and so on. So interestingly, Bach didn't defend himself in writing in that controversy either. He got a local lawyer, Birnbaum, to reply on his behalf. You can read the whole discussion in the Bach Reader, which is wonderful because it's in this very flowery 18th century prose. But my contention is that this major series of publications too, like the Klavierübung, which is 1739, the Leipzig Chorales, which started around that time too, in a sense are Bach's response to Scheibe, saying, okay, I'm not going to reply to you in words because that's not my language, but I'm going to reply to you this way, and I'm going to reply to you in musical science and musical rhetoric. And again, all of these influences, from the various violin schools, we know that he knew the French classical tradition very well from knowing French classical musicians in the court orchestra in Cello, for instance. And, he spent a lot of time transcribing Italian concertos, 18th century Italian concertos. He got a hold of L'Estro Ironico of Vivaldi 2 years after it was published, which is pretty amazing when you think about that.
Yeah.
But he took all of those things, all of those influences, and never just took the technique and copied it. He always took it, synthesized it, made it his own, and then used it to make a powerful theological or metaphorical statement of some kind. If you think about something like instrumentation in the St. John Passion, the only time that he uses the gamba is in Es ist vollbracht, where he's got, the king, the son of God, who's going to the sacrifice. But of course, he uses the gamba. That's the only time in the whole piece he uses it. But people would have associated the gamba with the French court and with royalty. He uses French rhythms in that. And so the instrument, just by being there, serves as a kind of metaphorical statement. And I'd be interested to know in the violin sonatas and partitas and the cello suites, if there are those kind of really, the organ music is just filled with those sorts of things. I could cite 10 examples just right here, just from the Leipzig Chorales, but in the cello and violin music, are there those kinds of statements that?
I think you're kind of referring to like topics, where the topic of French gamba, in this case is actually played by a gamba, or the French music is what you're describing is played by a gamba, but it kind of evokes the thing out of context.
Yes.
It's not in an actual French overture. It's just evoking and I think you'll find that a lot with the violin partitas and the cello suites, but maybe one at a time, and they sort of are the thing. Like if Bach writes a gigue, it is a gigue. It's not the topic of a gigue, but there is sort of the reference to typical things, sort of like in the preludes of the cello suites, sometimes I feel like it's a topic of keyboard prelude, but on the cello. So sort of, evoking that which would be natural to a sort of keyboard prelude, but then via the cello. So, but then sometimes it's just a courante, which is the pure thing itself. So I don't think it's evoking anything else. Is that what you're kind of referring to? But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I guess in the chorale-based works, it's a little bit easier
there's words.
because there's a text to
Yeah.
engage with or a theological context. And, so for instance, in the first Nunkom setting, Nunkom der Heiden Heiland, which is an Advent chorale, Savior, the nations come, Advent's a season of hope, but hope is a double-sided thing because you also don't know what's coming next. So there's an element of uncertainty and fear about it. And in the scripture readings in Advent, there's, also an element of judgment. Once he does come, boy, some people are going to have some things to answer for. So there's that aspect to Advent as well. And in the very first setting, it's a very slow adagio kind of music. In G minor, which is always a grave key for Bach, referring to what Emmanuel was talking about. And the bass is this kind of serpentine, walking, steady eighth notes that curve around. And then the left hand enters in a kind of stile antico imitation in two voices, which again, always has a certain kind of connotation for Bach. There's leader and follower, which, could be, people looking for meaning or something like that, while the troubles of the world are in this walking bass that's uncertain. And then finally, the cantus firmus comes in a highly ornamented style with very characteristically French ornamentation. And it's in the soprano. So it's like this beacon of hope that's soaring above all the other things. So, right there, Bach is using alluding to three completely different compositional genres within the first four bars of one piece to make a theological statement,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is pretty amazing.
Tour de force.
Oh, it's and it's seamless. It's utterly seamless. It doesn't feel like he's sticking three different things together. It's completely homogeneous, but clearly made up of three different kinds of parts.
I think with the cello suites, it's an exploration of a lot of different things. Like if you look at as a set, if you look at every sarabande, there's, you sort of see all the different possible sarabands. Not everyone has the accent on the second beat. Some of them, one is in a slower tempo, but it's more ornamental. Another uses chords on the second beat to show something. Another one is without any double stops or chords and just flows. It's sort of saying, I'm going to explore the whole repertoire of these possibilities for the cello via these suites. So you get a lot, and at one point you are asked to tune the cello with the top string to G. So instead of an A string, you have a second G string, and that's sort of a hearkening back to an older tuning. And then the very last suite is the sixth suite, which is tuned with a 5-string cello, which was, sort of popular, especially in France, but he's very specific. It must be tuned with the top string to E, which sort of implies that maybe normally it wouldn't be tuned that because he has to spell it out, because actually usually it would be top string D. And so he's sort of exploring, say, this old tuning, this other way, this 5-string version. One suite is in G major that's very resonant, so we use a lot of open strings, and then the other suite that's in E flat major is more difficult, so it has a whole different approach to the technique, and sort of like exploring the whole gamut of what's possible in both the dance forms and the preluding, but also within that cello and the idea of the cello. So it's very wide reaching, and yet it never reaches the technical demands of the violin music. So he still sort of stays, I mean, it's very hard music, trust me, but he sort of stays in the zone of what the cello is. So he's both expanding and respecting the tradition at the same time. I think that better answers kind of what you're talking about. Jonathan. Yeah. Do you think we should answer some couple questions before
Yeah,
we
we have a really neat question from Alexander Coutelius here, asking about was Bach influenced in his worldview or religious perspectives by any particular thinkers or their works, ancient or contemporary? This is a great question.
Thank you for that question. Who asked this question?
Alexander Coutelius.
Hello, Alexander.
he says
Maybe Jonathan, would this be appropriate to so we can exchange with people?
Sure, here I'll
if there's anything else you want to add to that question, or
ask you to unmute. I think you can unmute. Yeah, there you go. Excellent.
Yes, hi. I don't want to turn my camera on. I've been Zooming all day for work, so.
I understand.
he's in his PJs, we know.
I mean, honestly, yeah. So there you have it.
the picture
yeah, I'm enjoying this very much, and it's just interesting to hear this because I should just say I work for the Orchestre Classique de Montréal. I'm their development coordinator and also their administrative coordinator. But I know music, I love Bach, but I don't know much of the context about him. And so because I'm more familiar with 19th century and 20th century music, and I always think about what were the inspirations of the time, different works, different cultural movements, religious texts, in the case of Bach. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'm sure there's a lot. Please go all out on this. I'm really curious. Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Eleanor.
I mean, I would just say that it's always great to consider the world that Bach grew up in. And also, if you're interested in other than just this conversation, just learning yourself, there's some wonderful books that are, for example, there's this book called Johann Sebastian Bach, The Learned Musician, by Christoph Wolff. And yeah, it's a bit thick, but it's actually super easy to read and super pleasant. And one of my good friends, Tamara Bernstein, who was a critic in Toronto, said that it was the only time with a biography she cried at the end because she didn't want it to end. And it's a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And I mean, I think you'll just really get a lot of Bach and why he became who he is, a special circumstance that led to his composition, his excellence, and it's very easy and fun to read. So I just really recommend this book. And then I would say that, he grew up in an environment where his father was a musician, his older brother was a professional musician, his uncle was a very fine musician, and they were all working in church. And that the Lutheran upbringing, very rigorous schooling, was full of just traditions of, religious traditions that were just surrounding them. And then he also had further schooling at the St. Michael's School, which was another religious institution, and he worked in religious institutions. So just typical Lutheran doctrine is just a big underpinning. But as far as the things that he read, or there's, I think I'll defer to Jonathan about the actual sources that he might have read. I don't quite know much about that. I just consider it just a very solid German Lutheran background, where there's a lot of assumptions about what's correct and how the world is built, and a lot of science. Like when he went to school, he was studying a rhetoric, science, and that's all built into his music, I think. So I'll just turn it over to Jonathan, but I think that's just a good start us off with that. So, yeah.
Well, if we work backwards from the end of Bach's life, the firmest documentary evidence we have is, of course, in his estate, the summary of his estate after he died. And there's a fair bit of discussion about, because his library is listed and mostly itemized quite specifically in there. There's some discussion about why it looks the way that it does. But if we look at it, he had an enormous, by the standards of the time, he had an enormous library of theological books that would have actually been the envy of a lot of professional theologians in the day, academic theologians in the day. He had 2 copies of Luther's commentary on the scriptures, which is a big multi-volume work. He had the Greater and Lesser Lutheran Catechisms. He had Mitzler's commentary on the Catechism. He had a lot of classic church fathers in German translations, some of them in Latin as well. Various, many writings of Luther himself. He knew Luther's own writings very well. When he got the job in Leipzig, he was, of course, tested on his musical knowledge, and he had to write a cantata and perform it and so on, and had to play the organ and had to do various other things. And he was questioned about pedagogy and his teaching ability and so on for the choir school and all of that, and choir training and those kind of mundane things. But the really important part was, especially in a place like Leipzig that was quite conservative, he had to undergo a detailed theological examination. So he had to be able to answer detailed questions about the Luther longer and shorter catechisms, and also be able to quote at length excerpts from the Mitzler commentary on the catechism. So, he had this profound knowledge. And there was a train of thought in musicology for quite a long time that, he just went along with this, but he was actually, the first secular humanist, and, that he just went along with all this Lutheran stuff because he had to do it. But inconveniently for that strain of scholarship, in the 1980s, the Calaf Bible was discovered in Michigan in a farmhouse attic of all things. And it turns out that it was a Bible, a large Bible that belonged to Bach, and it's filled with marginalia in Bach's own handwriting, which, we can see that there are specific passages highlighted that he used in cantatas and so on. And you can see that he was working out the theological implications of these passages and making references to various commentaries and so on. But also there are some very personal kinds of remarks in there too that obviously have nothing to do with anything he was doing professionally, but they're just his either asking questions about things that are said with real assurance in scripture, and him wrestling with meaning, and trying to find meaning and trying to reconcile his own life experience with what he was reading in scripture. And, if we think about Bach's life, it wasn't unusual for a person of that time, but his first wife died at a very young age. Between his 2 wives and they lost a lot of children at an early age. Even some of their children who made it to adulthood had a lot of trouble, as children will do sometimes. And Bach really, went to bat for some of those kids, and we have the letters to prove it, So he suffered a lot. And in the Calaf Bible, in some of those annotations, we see this very, very human engagement on the part of Bach, trying to reconcile his faith with, the normal doubts that would come along. There's a wonderful essay on a more abstract level by John Butt in the Cambridge Companion to Bach, which is another great book that, if you don't have it, I highly recommend it. It's a superb essay called Bach's Metaphysics of Music, and it really places Bach in the universe of the rationalist thinkers of his day, Spinoza and Leibniz and so on. And it's trying to reconcile Bach, the devout Lutheran, with Bach, the creative artist, with Bach, the social creature, and Bach in the context of the philosophy of his day. And the conclusion of the essay, really, in a nutshell, is that he didn't really fit into any of those categories very neatly, which I think is a pretty nice summary of his music too. It defies categorization. We look at it through any lens of the time, and he was always striving to exceed. If he took a model and learned from a model, of somebody else's composition, he always took that model and blew it up far beyond the possibilities of the original and made it his own and made it into something much grander and much more perfect. Even, fun case, Vivaldi Concerti. One of the concertos we know they performed in Dresden because we have the parts from the library in Dresden that survived, and they're missing the bass line. So Bach composed a new bass line, but in the meantime, we found the original Vivaldi printed edition in Italy, which was unknown to Bach. But of course, Bach's bass line is way more elaborate than Vivaldi's original. And from my Teutonic chauvinistic slight background, I would say it's far superior to Vivaldi's, but of course Vivaldi was a great composer too. But it's really interesting to see what Bach did when he had carte blanche and had to fill in the blanks and how he did it, even with a composer's work that he greatly, greatly respected as he respected Vivaldi.
Yeah.
If I can add one word or a couple words to this beautiful exposition that Jonathan just gave. Luther's name was mentioned a lot, and I some notes that I shared earlier with Jonathan and Eleanor. It's an older paper. It's an older book from Albert Schweitzer, but he writes in there that Bach, at 23, resigned from what it was like a very first job at church in Mulhausen, because Bach visualized a new regulation of religious life through music. His life's work, as he saw it, was to bring about a reformation of the church out of the spirit of music in the same way that Luther had done through the word. In 1708, the 23-year-old Bach submitted a resignation to the Municipal Council of Mulhausen, in which he described his reason for his resignation as being unable to work for my very end in organizing church music well. And so then kind of like the trajectory of his life is, I would say transcending the forms, or, expanding his language in this form to to include as many possibilities. There's a beautiful quote by Pablo Casals that I would like to share. He says, "The wonder of Bach is unsurpassed in any other art. Human nature is hollowed out until it takes on a godlike profile. Through Bach's music, God becomes more human and the human becomes more divine. This is the work of Bach."
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Were there any other questions from those of you listening? Okay. Yeah, no questions. Farah, you're just hanging out. Yeah. I know Jean is here. I don't know everybody else, but yeah. Unmute, Farah.
Okay, I just wanted to mention too, on the thing about knowing about loss and death, especially with his wives and children. Bach himself, at the age of 9 or 10, lost both parents.
Mm-hmm.
And that must have been extraordinarily traumatic for him. I think it was in a matter of a couple of months when he lost both his mother and father. And then he was shipped off to this older brother, somebody who was like 15 years older than him, one of his elder siblings. And so I think his whole world, I mean, that must be utterly, utterly traumatic for a child to lose your parents like that. So I think too, he would have to like rely on himself a lot, for this kind of order, because his whole world was turned upside down at such a young age. So that's something to think about, because what happens to you in your young years really forms who you are. That's what I wanted to say. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, Farah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just reading about Bach's childhood, and I thought it was really interesting how around the years that his parents died, the first few years after, he had a lot of absences at school, and he like was only 14th in his class or 20th in his class, a big class. But then, you know, when he starts to stabilize and maybe his morning is over, or he's doing better, I don't know, doing better, I guess. He just starts climbing up. I mean, obviously he's just brilliant and starts to be first in his class, second in his class, and you know, has such a strong academic future. And it just reminds me of how even these days, you know, when children or anyone is going through trauma, it's hard to be your full to, you know, be realizing your full potential. And yet at the same time, that hardship can give you a lot of the special tools that you use later in life. And so you kind of wouldn't have it any other way for Bach, because maybe it gave him something extra or special or different. So
and also he was always very, I mean, he was a cantankerous person. He was always fighting with town councilmen and all these, you know,
he was thrown in jail.
Right. And but because he had such purpose in life, and so he wanted, because he was so excellent, I think he just wanted to be surrounded by excellence. And so he couldn't understand these, you know, the level of sub musicianships from, you know, the town players and what have you. So I think, yeah, you know, having this life purpose at 23, this really put him on the trajectory for greatness and excellence. That he didn't falter, you know, it was just straight, you know, it was really quite remarkable. Yeah. So.
It was a very telling in his plea for a, you know, a well-ordered church music that he submitted in Leipzig after he'd been there for a while and was finding it somewhat troublesome. He got into trouble with Ernesti, who was the rector of the school, about who was in charge of what, and there wasn't a clear division of responsibility, or at least it was clear to Bach, but Ernesti had a different view of it. But he talked about the difficulties of, you know, dealing with a choir school where the only criterion for admission was not the musical skill of the students. And so he classified the boys into 3 different levels. There were those who were very good, and those who could be good if they would work at it and had the right kind of guidance. And then there were those who were utterly useless, which is pretty terrible pedagogy. But you can see where Bach was, you know, where his tolerance were and where his focus was, that it had to be good or it wasn't worth doing.
But it's like he didn't have any, he was so like alert, and he didn't have time for mediocrity. Nope. And he didn't have time for mediocrity around him. Nope. So and especially the boys' school, you know, he was very adamant. He did not want to teach Latin, you know, it was just, yeah, you know, he just wanted to teach music. And it's absolutely amazing what he did, how he was able to produce so much, being a part of this boys' school and churning out these cantatas and all this stuff. It's so remarkable. How did he do this week after week? You know, amazing.
You should see Jonathan's schedule.
Yeah.
I said to a friend, I'm going to look like Keith Richards by the end of this year. It's not good.
He's trying to imitate the olden days. Yeah. So.
Well, this has been wonderful, everyone. It's been so good to have you all here and to have you in the discussion. If there are any further questions, thoughts?
So the series starts tomorrow.
Yes.
With Eleanor.
Yeah, and it's on YouTube at.
I will
maybe
share it in the comments right here.
Good idea.
Yeah. stpaul.com. So this week is a bit of a blowout to start the series. We have the symposium tonight that we're having right now. Eleanor is on tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Then I'm on Wednesday at 7. Emmanuel is on Thursday at 7. And then on Friday at 7, in case you missed it, is the first movement of the Brahms Requiem that we did last fall with the choir at the church and OSM players. And it's a chamber arrangement by Joachim Linkelmann. So it's a pretty wonderful production as well. So you can catch that on Friday evening at 7.
Okay.
And we'll keep that pattern for the next 7 weeks until we're through the Brahms. And then after that, it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday each week. We soldier on
18
with
weeks. 18 weeks.
18 weeks worth.
Yeah.
The break in Easter week, right?
That's right.
Yes.
Nothing in Holy
Good
Week.
point. Yeah.
Just,
Thanks, Jean.
Thank you very much,
Wonderful.
everyone, for joining us.
so good to see you all. Take care.
Thank you, Jonathan.